Hi everybody, it's Vanessa here from the Craft Corner, and today I'm going to talk to you a little bit about one of my favourite paintings from one of my favourite countries, the Great Wave from Japan. The full name of this painting is the Great Wave of Kanagawa. It was painted and created around 1830 to 1833, and it's actually a print, so a print was created from the original artwork. The artist that created this painting, my favorite painting, was called Katsushika Hokusai. So he was a Japanese artist from Edo, which is now called Tokyo in Japan. And in the 1830s, he created this series of prints, all focused on Mount Fuji. So Mount Fuji is the tallest mountain in Japan, and it's also considered sacred to the Japanese culture and people. So around this time, it would have been perhaps one of the most important symbols in Japan and very distinctive. Everybody would have known what Mount Fuji was and would have recognized it in a print. One of the reasons that the Great Wave became so famous, and here is an example of it, is because it was a print. So when it was created, thousands of copies were printed and they were sold really cheaply all over Japan, and even outside Japan, which we'll talk about a little bit more later on. So it meant that so many people got to see and own copies of this artwork. And because it was a series, it grew in popularity. There was 36 views of Mount Fuji, it was called, and each artwork featured Mount Fuji in it. Sometimes it was more prominent and sometimes it was much further away, where here the wave is dominant in the artwork. So this became known, probably one of the most quintessentially Japanese artworks. When people think of Japan and Japanese art, I'm guessing that even if they don't know the artist or the history, that this image comes to mind. In fact, it became so famous that even in the modern day, brands like Quiksilver and Roxy, their logos are inspired by the Great Wave. So I want to talk a little bit about Japanese history around this time. In the 1600s, 1603 to be precise, the ruling government of the time enacted this policy, which translated roughly as chained country, which was called sakoku. So sakoku was this policy that continued for 265 years in Japan, which basically restricted people from either visiting Japan or leaving Japan. So common people, so if you weren't a member of one of the higher clans or in the government or the ruling clans, you wouldn't have been allowed to leave Japan. And who could come into Japan, but also what could come into Japan, was very restricted as well. So for 265 years, Japan lived in this little bubble full of their own culture with very little influence from the outside world. But the influence that did come in, that was really important to the artwork that we're talking about today. So for these hundreds of years, Japan only let certain countries trade with them. So that meant bring goods in and take goods out. One of these countries was the Dutch. So Dutch traders were allowed to come to trade with Japan in the port of Nagasaki. So Nagasaki became like a gateway for Europeans, or the Dutch most specifically. And there are many stories of failed attempts of other countries, either by force or by diplomacy, trying to gain entry to Japan. But for 265 years, that was restricted. So Dutch influence can be seen in this artwork. So you can see some influences in Hokusai's artwork from his exposure to the Dutch. First of all, in the Prussian blue colours in the print, which would have been very distinctive from Europe and from Dutch artwork of the time. And also in his exposure to linear perspective, which again wasn't usual to Japanese artwork. And Hokusai took the concept of linear perspective and he made it his own. Also, one thing that you see in a lot of his artwork is his interest in low and high horizon lines, which we touched on in our compositions lesson earlier in this term. And he created his own version or his own interpretation of linear perspective. So he's taking his elements from other cultures and he's putting it into a Japanese artwork and a Japanese lens. Other things that you see in Hokusai's artwork are that interest in near and far. So while Mount Fuji is the focus of all of these prints, here it's very far away. So this artwork was made in a woodblock print, and it was a multicolor print, which is also called a polychrome print. The type of woodblock was ukiyo-e, which, if you're interested, I can do a separate video on that. And there's actually some really interesting videos showing you the traditional technique of this Japanese woodblock printing. So there would have been several layers. And one thing that the printers did was they overlaid the different blues. So there was Prussian blue and indigo blue in this, and they overlaid over in the waves, which created that sense of depth and sort of a 3D perspective where you see the different blues in the wave itself. So a little bit more about that Japanese history of the time. So for this period of 265 years, Japanese artwork wasn't really exposed to the outside world, except for these little glimpses that came in through these narrow gateways from the Dutch traders. In 1853, Japan ended up opening up to the world when there was a treaty. It was called the Convention of Kanagawa. And that treaty meant that Japan started trading with America, which really opened it up to the rest of the world. But what really interests me about the Japanese history is that period in time when they were secluded, and seeing how little pieces of other cultures come into their artwork, but how they really keep that beautiful Japanese style and perspective and traditions in terms of how they create their artworks. And that's what really fascinates me. And that is why this is one of my favorite artworks of all time. And actually in previous lessons, we've touched on this because late 1800s, artists like Vincent van Gogh were inspired by these Japanese artworks. And this sort of movement where you can see almost like fingers coming out of the wave, you can see some resemblances of this in Van Gogh's artwork, Starry, Starry Night. But that's a story for another day. So I hope you enjoyed that little insight into Japan, one of my favorite artworks in Japanese history. We're now going to go on to study the first of our two-part series, really three-part series, on Japan and Japanese art. And we're going to study this artwork and create our own version of the Great Wave. So we're going to be looking at composition, the rule of composition that you see in this artwork, and how Hokusai made it his own. So I hope you've enjoyed this little video, and I will see you in the next lesson.